Picture this. You're alone in the wilderness, facing down 400 pounds of pure rage, with nothing but your bare hands and the desperate screams of two children echoing behind you. Most people would run. Most people would freeze. But ranch hand Jake Morrison wasn't most people. What happened next in those woods of northern Montana would change 3 lives forever, and the reward he received. Well, that's a story nobody saw coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of September 15th started like any other at the Whispering Pines Ranch in Glacier County, Montana. Jake Morrison pulled on his worn leather boots as the first rays of sunlight crept through the windows of the modest bunkhouse he called home. At 28 years old, Jake had spent the better part of a decade working ranches across the American West. But something about this place felt different. Maybe it was the way the Rocky Mountains seemed to cradle the valley, or how the morning mist danced across the pastures like ghosts of ancient spirits. Jake had arrived at Whispering Pines 3 months earlier, another drifter looking for honest work and a place to rest his head. The ranch owner, Tom Brennan, was getting on in years and needed reliable help managing his 1,500 acres of prime Montana grazing land. What Jake hadn't expected was the family that lived in the small cabin near the eastern boundary of the property. Elena Clearwater was unlike anyone Jake had ever met. A Cherokee woman in her early 30s, she possessed a quiet strength that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within her soul. Her long black hair often caught the light like polished obsidian, and her dark eyes held wisdom that spoke of generations of survival and resilience. She lived in the cabin with her 2 daughters, 8-year-old Lily and 6-year-old Rose, after her husband Michael had been killed in a logging accident. 2 years prior, Tom Brennan had offered Elena and her girls the cabin rent-free, in exchange for her help with the ranch's bookkeeping and occasional cooking for the seasonal workers. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement that allowed Elena to raise her daughters in the shadow of the mountains her ancestors had called home for centuries. While providing Tom with the most honest and hard-working tenant he'd ever had, Jake first encountered Elena on his 2nd week at the ranch. He'd been mending fence posts near the creek that ran behind her cabin when he heard the sound of laughter carried on the wind. 2 young girls emerged from the tree line, their arms full of wildflowers and their faces bright with the kind of joy that only children seem to possess. Behind them walked Elena, her movements graceful and purposeful as she guided her daughters back toward home. "You must be the new ranch hand Tom mentioned," she said, approaching the fence line where Jake worked. Her voice carried a slight accent, a musical quality that seemed to blend the cadences of her Cherokee heritage with the broader inflections of rural Montana. Jake straightened up, suddenly conscious of the sweat on his brow and the dirt under his fingernails. "Yes, ma'am." Jake Morrison. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect his father had taught him years ago. "Elena Clearwater," she replied with a warm smile. "These are my daughters, Lily and Rose." The 2 girls peeked out from behind their mother's skirt, their dark eyes curious and bright. Lily, the older of the 2, possessed her mother's serious demeanor, while Rose seemed to bubble with barely contained energy. "Are you a real cowboy?" Rose asked suddenly, her voice high and excited. Jake chuckled, crouching down to meet the little girl at eye level. "Well, I suppose I am. I take care of the cattle and horses, fix fences, and do whatever needs doing around the ranch." "Do you have a horse?" Lily asked, stepping forward with the cautious curiosity of her age. "I do. Her name's Dakota, and she's about the smartest horse I've ever had the pleasure of working with." Over the following weeks, Jake found himself looking forward to these chance encounters with Elena and her daughters. Sometimes he'd see them walking along the creek, collecting stones or watching for the hawks that nested in the tall pines. Other times, Elena would stop by wherever he was working to bring him a cup of coffee or a sandwich, always with a kind word and that gentle smile that seemed to light up even the grayest Montana days. Jake learned that Eleanor had grown up on the Crow Reservation about 2 hours south of the ranch. but had met her late husband Michael while studying accounting at Montana State University in Bozeman. They'd planned to build a life together, maybe start their own business. But those dreams died with Michael on a rain-soaked logging road in the Bitterroot Mountains. "Sometimes I wonder if I should move back to the reservation," Elena confided to Jake one afternoon as they watched her daughters play by the creek. "My mother keeps saying the girls need to be around their people to learn the old ways." Jake considered this carefully before responding. "From what I can see, you're raising them just fine right here. They're happy, they're healthy, and they know who they are. Sometimes the best place to honor the old ways is wherever you can live them authentically." Elena looked at him with surprise, as if she hadn't expected such wisdom from a ranch hand who drifted in from nowhere. "You speak like someone who's done some thinking about these things." "I've done my share of wandering," Jake replied. "Seen enough places to know that home isn't always about geography. Sometimes it's about finding where you belong." As summer stretched into early fall, Jake found himself becoming more than just a ranch hand at Whispering Pines. He became a friend to Elena, a source of gentle guidance and practical help that she hadn't realized she'd been missing. When the cabin's roof started leaking, Jake spent his Sunday afternoon patching it. When Elena's old truck wouldn't start on a cold morning, Jake was there with jumper cables and a patient hand. The girls began to look forward to his visits as well. Jake would sometimes bring them small gifts, a smooth stone he'd found while checking the fence lines, or a feather dropped by one of the hawks. He taught Lily how to whistle and showed Rose the best spots along the creek to find pollywogs and water striders. "You're good with them," Elena observed one evening as they watched the girls chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "They're good kids," Jake replied. "Smart as whips, both of them. They remind me a lot of their mother." Eleanor felt something stir in her chest at those words, something she'd thought had died with Michael. It wasn't just attraction, though Jake's quiet strength and genuine kindness certainly appealed to her. It was the feeling of possibility, of maybe not having to carry the weight of single motherhood entirely alone. But Eleanor was cautious by nature, and she'd learned to be even more so since Michael's death. She'd seen too many women jump into relationships out of loneliness, only to find themselves worse off than before. If something was going to develop between her and Jake, it would have to happen naturally, built on genuine connection rather than desperation or convenience. Jake seemed to understand this instinctively. He never pushed, never presumed, never made Elena feel like she owed him anything for his kindness. He was simply present, reliable, steady, and increasingly important to the daily rhythm of life at the cabin by the creek. September arrived with the first hints of autumn color beginning to touch the aspens that dotted the mountainsides. The nights were getting cooler, and Elena had started thinking about winter preparations, splitting wood, stocking the pantry, making sure the cabin was ready for Montana's legendary cold. "I've been meaning to ask," she said to Jake one afternoon as he helped her stack firewood behind the cabin. "Would you like to join us for dinner on Sunday? I'm making venison stew, and the girls have been asking when you're going to eat with us instead of just stopping by." Jake paused in his work, a piece of split pine balanced in his hands. "I'd like that very much," he said simply. Sunday dinner became a weekly tradition. Elena would cook, always something delicious that seemed to combine traditional Cherokee ingredients with hearty ranch fare, while Jake would help the girls with whatever project had captured their attention that week. Sometimes it was a puzzle, sometimes a drawing, sometimes just stories about the animals he'd seen. During his work around the ranch, these evenings felt like the closest thing to a real family Jake had experienced since leaving his childhood home in Wyoming 15 years earlier. There was something about the warmth of Elena's cabin, the laughter of her daughters, and the easy conversation that flowed between the adults that made Jake want to protect this fragile happiness. With everything he had, he was about to discover just how far he was willing to go to do exactly that. The morning of September 22nd dawned clear and cool, with the kind of crystalline air that made the mountains look close enough to touch. Jake had plans to ride the upper pastures, checking on a small herd of cattle that had been grazing the high meadows through the summer. It was routine work, but he enjoyed these solitary rides through country that still looked much as it had when the first mountain men had pushed through these valleys 2 centuries earlier. Elena had mentioned that she and the girls were planning to hike to Beaver Creek that afternoon, a favorite spot about 2 miles from the cabin where they liked to collect stones and look for signs of the wildlife that came to drink. It was a routine they'd followed dozens of times, a safe and familiar excursion that would give the girls a chance to explore, while Elena enjoyed the peace of the wilderness. That had always been her refuge. Neither Jake nor Elena could have predicted that this seemingly ordinary day would test every assumption they'd made about safety, about courage, and about the bonds that can form between people who find each other in the vast loneliness of the American West. As Jake saddled Dakota in the pre-dawn darkness, he had no way of knowing that by sunset he would have faced death in its most primal form, and that the woman he'd come to care for more than he'd ever admitted would be forced to confront feelings she'd kept carefully locked away. Since her husband's death, the wilderness of Montana keeps its own schedule, follows its own rules, and on this particular morning, those rules were about to collide with the lives of 3 people who had found something precious in each other's company, something worth fighting for, something worth dying for. The sun climbed higher over the Rockies as Jake guided Dakota along the familiar trails that wound through the upper reaches of Whispering Pines Ranch, unaware that miles away, Elena was helping her daughters lace up their hiking boots and fill water bottles for what should have been a peaceful afternoon walk to their favorite creek. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In the dense forests between the ranch and Beaver Creek, something massive and hungry was stirring in the shadows, driven by instincts older than human memory and a desperation that would soon bring it into collision with a family that had done nothing more than seek a few hours of happiness in the wilderness they called home. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy of lodgepole pines as Eleanor and her daughters made their way along the familiar trail toward Beaver Creek. Rose skipped ahead, her small backpack bouncing with each enthusiastic step, while Lily walked beside her mother, pointing out various wildflowers and asking endless questions about the plants they passed. "Mom, why do some trees have white bark and others don't?" Lily asked, running her hand along the smooth trunk of an aspen. "Different trees grow in different ways," Eleanor explained, adjusting her own pack. "The aspens with white bark are like the birch trees my grandmother used to harvest back on the reservation. She'd use their bark for making containers and even writing messages." Rose had stopped about 30 yards ahead, crouching beside a fallen log. "Mom, come look at this." Elena and Lily quickened their pace to catch up. Rose was examining a series of scratches carved deep into the rotting wood, 4 parallel grooves that looked like they'd been made by something with very sharp claws. "What made these marks?" Rose asked, tracing one of the scratches with her finger. Elena felt a small chill run down her spine as she examined the gouges. They were fresh, possibly made within the last few days, and they were deep enough to suggest something much larger than the black bears that occasionally wandered through the area. She'd grown up in Montana wilderness and knew the signs of different animals. But these scratches were unlike anything she'd seen before. "Probably just a bear marking its territory," she said, keeping her voice casual so as not to alarm the girls. "Bears sometimes scratch trees to let other bears know they've been in an area." What Elena didn't mention was that these scratches were too high, too wide, and too deep for a typical black bear. "Something much larger had made these marks, and recently. Can we still go to the creek?" Lily asked, sensing some tension in her mother's voice. Elena looked ahead through the trees. Beaver Creek was still another mile away, and the trail would take them deeper into the forest. Every instinct she'd inherited from generations of Cherokee ancestors was telling her to turn back. to take her daughters home to the safety of their cabin. But the rational part of her mind pushed back against what felt like irrational fear. She'd hiked these trails dozens of times with the girls. They'd never encountered anything more dangerous than the occasional deer or curious squirrel. The scratches could have been made by a black bear days ago, and the animal could be miles away by now. "Of course, we can go to the creek," she decided. "But we're going to stay close together, and we'll head home before it gets too late." Meanwhile, 5 miles away in the upper pastures, Jake was having troubles of his own. Dakota had been acting nervous all morning, her ears constantly swiveling and her nostrils flaring as if she was picking up scents that worried her. Several times she'd stopped mid-stride and refused to move forward until Jake had coaxed her with gentle words and steady pressure from his legs. The cattle in the high meadow seemed agitated as well. Instead of their usual calm grazing, they were bunched together in tight groups, their heads raised and alert. Jake had seen this behavior before. It usually meant a predator was somewhere in the area, though he couldn't spot any sign of wolves or mountain lions. As he guided Dakota along the ridge that overlooked the valley below, something caught his eye in the distance. Smoke was rising from the direction of the Clearwater cabin, but it was too much smoke for Elena's usual afternoon cooking. Jake pulled his binoculars from his saddlebags and focused on the area around the cabin. What he saw made his blood run cold. The cabin's front door was standing wide open, swinging gently in the breeze. Elena's truck was parked in its usual spot, but there was no sign of life around the property. More concerning was a large section of the vegetable garden that had been completely destroyed, as if something massive had simply plowed through it. Jake lowered the binoculars and tried to think rationally. There could be innocent explanations for what he was seeing. Maybe Elena had left the door open for ventilation. Maybe a deer had gotten into the garden. Maybe the smoke was just from her wood stove. But Dakota was still nervous beneath him, her muscles tense and ready to bolt. Animals had instincts that humans often ignored, and right now every fiber of Dakota's being was telling her that something was very wrong in the valley below. Jake made a decision that would save 3 lives instead of continuing his planned route through the upper pastures. He turned Dakota toward the trail that would take him down to the cabin. If everything was fine, he'd apologize for the intrusion and maybe help Elena clean up her garden. If something was wrong, he wanted to be there to help. Back at Beaver Creek, Elena and her daughters had finally reached their destination. The creek gurgled peacefully over smooth stones, creating the kind of tranquil soundtrack that had always helped Elena clear her mind and reconnect with the natural world that had shaped her ancestors for centuries. Rose immediately kicked off her shoes and waded into the shallow water, squealing with delight at how cold it was. Lily was more cautious, testing the temperature with her toe before deciding it was too cold for her liking. "Can we build a dam?" Rose asked, already gathering stones from the creek bed. "A small one," Elena agreed, settling onto a fallen log where she could watch both girls while enjoying the peaceful surroundings. For the next hour, they played by the creek in the kind of carefree way that reminded Elena why she'd chosen to raise her daughters in this wild, beautiful country rather than moving back to the reservation where her mother lived. Here, surrounded by mountains and forests that stretched beyond the horizon, Lily and Rose could grow up understanding their place in the natural world, learning lessons that no classroom could teach. The sun was beginning to sink lower in the western sky when Elena decided it was time to head home. "Come on, girls. We need to start back if we want to get home before dark," Rose protested, as Elena had known she would. "Just 5 more minutes, Mama, please." "We can come back next weekend," Elena promised, helping Rose put her shoes back on. "But Jake is coming for dinner tonight, remember? We need to get home so I can start cooking." The mention of Jake was enough to motivate both girls to pack up their creek treasures and prepare for the hike home. They'd grown fond of the quiet ranch hand, who always seemed to have time for their questions and who brought their mother, a kind of happiness they hadn't seen since their father died. As they started back along the trail, Elena felt that same uneasy sensation she'd experienced earlier. The forest seemed too quiet, as if the birds and small animals that usually provided a constant background chorus had suddenly gone silent. She told herself it was just her imagination, maybe influenced by those scratches they'd seen on the fallen log. But as they walked deeper into the woods, the feeling of being watched grew stronger rather than weaker. "Mama?" Lily said quietly. "Why did all the birds stop singing?" Elena had been wondering the same thing. In healthy forest ecosystems, there was almost always some kind of wildlife activity. Birds calling, squirrels chattering, insects buzzing. But now there was only the sound of their footsteps on the pine needles and their own breathing. "Sometimes the forest gets quiet in the evening," Elena said, though she didn't really believe her own explanation. "Animals are getting ready for nighttime." They continued walking, but Elena found herself constantly looking over her shoulder and listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. Several times, she thought she heard something large moving parallel to their trail. But whenever she stopped to listen more carefully, the sounds would stop too. Rose, who had been chattering constantly during their afternoon at the creek, had grown unusually quiet. Even at 6 years old, she could sense the tension in her mother and sister, and her natural instinct was to stay close and make herself small. They were about halfway home when they heard it, a sound that made Elena's blood freeze in her veins. It started as a low rumbling, like distant thunder, but it was coming from somewhere in the forest rather than from the sky. The sound grew deeper and more menacing, evolving into something between a growl and a roar that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath their feet. Elena had heard that sound once before, years ago, when she was camping with her father in Yellowstone National Park. It was the sound of a grizzly bear. But this was deeper and more powerful than anything she remembered from that encounter. "Girls," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "I want you to get behind me and stay very still." Lily and Rose obeyed immediately, sensing the seriousness in their mother's tone. Elena slowly reached into her backpack for the can of bear spray she always carried on their hikes. Though she prayed she wouldn't need to use it, the growling sound came again, closer this time. And Elena realized with growing horror that whatever was making that noise was between them and the trail home. They were trapped in a small clearing, surrounded by dense forest, with no clear escape route. That's when she saw it. The grizzly bear that emerged from the tree line was the largest animal Elena had ever seen in the wild. It stood nearly 8 feet tall on its hind legs, its massive shoulders rippling with muscle beneath thick brown fur. Its head was enormous, with small dark eyes that fixed on Elena and her daughters, with an intelligence that was somehow more terrifying than mindless aggression would have been. This wasn't a young bear looking for an easy meal, or even a mother bear defending cubs. This was a massive male grizzly, probably weighing close to 600 pounds, that had likely been driven down from the higher elevations by hunger or territorial pressure from other bears. Elena knew enough about bear behavior to understand that their situation was extremely dangerous. Grizzlies were unpredictable, capable of incredible speed despite their size, and this one was clearly agitated about something. "Whatever happens," she whispered to her daughters, "don't run. Stay behind me, and don't make any sudden movements." The bear dropped back to all fours and began moving toward them with a deliberate predatory gait that left no doubt about its intentions. Elena raised the can of bear spray, though she knew it would be effective only if the bear came within about 10 feet, close enough that she might not have time to deploy it effectively. Behind her, she could hear Rose beginning to cry quietly, and Lily whispering what might have been a prayer in Cherokee that their grandmother had taught them. Elena had always wondered how she would react in a life-or-death situation. Now she discovered that her primary emotion wasn't fear for herself, but a fierce, maternal determination to protect her daughters. Even if it cost her own life, the bear was now less than 30 feet away and still approaching. When they heard the sound of hoofbeats thundering through the forest, Jake Morrison burst. into the clearing on Dakota's back like something out of an old Western movie, his hat gone and his face grim with determination. He'd followed the sounds of Elena's voice and the bears growling through the maze of forest trails, pushing Dakota harder than he'd ever pushed her before. What he saw in the clearing made his heart nearly stop. Elena was standing protectively in front of her daughters, facing down a grizzly bear that was large enough to kill all three of them without breaking stride. Without hesitation, Jake spurred Dakota directly toward the bear, shouting at the top of his lungs and waving his arms to make himself appear as large and threatening as possible. It was a desperate gambit. Grizzly bears were perfectly capable of killing, horses and riders alike, but it was the only chance he could see to draw the bear's attention away from Elena and the girls. The strategy worked, but not in the way Jake had hoped. Instead of being frightened away by the charging horse and rider, the grizzly bear turned its full attention to this new threat. It reared up on its hind legs again, roaring with a sound that seemed to shake the very trees, and prepared to meet Jake's charge with one of its own. Dakota, to her credit, held her course until the last possible moment before veering sharply to the left. Jake had just enough time to leap from the saddle before the bear's massive paw swiped through the space where his head had been a split second before. He hit the ground hard and rolled, coming up in a crouch just as the bear landed back on all fours and swung its massive head toward him. They were now face to face, predator and protector, in a confrontation that would be decided by courage, quick thinking, and perhaps a measure of luck that Jake prayed he still possessed. Behind him, he could hear Elena calling his name, but he didn't dare turn around. The bear was watching him with those small, intelligent eyes, calculating its next move with the patience of a creature that had survived by being both powerful and smart. Jake slowly reached for the hunting knife on his belt, a pitiful weapon against 600 pounds of muscle and claw, but the only tool he had available. As his fingers closed around the handle, he found himself thinking about Elena's smile, about Rose's laughter, about Lily's serious questions, and about all the Sunday dinners they might never share if he failed in the next few minutes. The bear began to move toward him, and Jake Morrison prepared to fight for the lives of three people who had become more precious to him than his own existence. The grizzly bear moved with deceptive speed for such a massive creature, closing the distance between itself and Jake in 3 powerful strides. Jake had perhaps 2 seconds to react before 600 pounds of muscle and fury would be on top of him. Years of ranch work had given Jake reflexes honed by dangerous situations, spooked cattle, aggressive bulls, horses that could kill with a single kick. But nothing had prepared him for the raw, primal terror of facing a predator that had ruled these mountains for thousands of years. As the bear charged, Jake dove to his right, rolling behind a fallen pine trunk that was thick enough to provide temporary cover. The bear's momentum carried it past his position, but it recovered with alarming agility, spinning around to face him with a roar that seemed to shake pine needles from the surrounding trees. "Elena, get the girls out of here!" Jake shouted, never taking his eyes off the bear. "Follow the creek bed north. It'll take you back to the ranch." "I'm not leaving you!" Elena's voice carried a desperation that cut through Jake's concentration for a split second. "You have to. Think about Lily and Rose." Elena knew he was right, but every instinct in her body rebelled against abandoning the man who had risked everything to save them. She grabbed her daughter's hands and began pulling them toward the edge of the clearing, but Rose's legs seemed frozen with terror. The bear feinted toward Jake, testing his reactions, looking for an opening. Jake kept the fallen log between them, moving in a slow circle that kept the massive animal at bay while he tried to formulate some kind of plan. His hunting knife felt pathetically small in his hand, but it was all he had. "Mama, we can't leave him," Lily whispered, tears streaming down her face as she watched the deadly dance between Jake and the grizzly. Elena's heart was breaking, but she knew that Jake's sacrifice would be meaningless if she didn't get her daughters to safety. She lifted Rose into her arms and grabbed Lily's hand, pulling them both toward what she hoped was the path to the creek. That's when the bear made its move. Perhaps sensing that its prey was trying to escape, the grizzly suddenly abandoned its cautious approach to Jake and wheeled toward Elena and the girls. In that moment, Jake realized that his strategy of drawing the bear away from them had failed catastrophically. Without thinking, Jake vaulted over the fallen log and threw himself directly onto the bear's back, wrapping his arms around the massive creature's neck in a desperate attempt to prevent it from reaching Eleanor and her daughters. The bear reared up on its hind legs, with Jake clinging to its back, roaring with fury at this unprecedented attack. For a moment, Jake felt like he was riding a mountain of pure rage, holding on with every ounce of strength he possessed while the bear spun and thrashed. Trying to dislodge him, Jake managed to get his hunting knife positioned against the bear's throat, but before he could use it, one of the bear's massive paws reached back and caught him across the ribs, with claws that cut through his shirt and into flesh like razors through paper. The blow sent Jake flying through the air. He crashed into a pine tree with enough force to drive the breath from his lungs and send stars exploding across his vision. Blood from the claw, marks across his ribs, soaked through his shirt, and his left shoulder felt like it might be dislocated. The bear landed back on all fours and turned toward him, blood from a small cut on its neck matting the fur around its throat. Jake's knife had inflicted a minor wound, but nothing that would slow down an animal of this size and determination. As Jake struggled to get back to his feet, he saw Elena making a decision that terrified him more than his own impending death. Instead of continuing toward safety, Elena had set Rose down and was moving back toward the clearing. In her hands was a thick branch she'd picked up from the forest floor, and her dark eyes blazed with a fury that matched the bear's own rage. "Eleanor, no!" Jake gasped, but she was already in motion. Elena Clearwater had lost one man she loved to the wilderness of Montana. She would not lose another without a fight. She brought the branch down across the bear's back with all the strength in her body. The impact made a sound like a gunshot echoing through the forest. And for a moment, the bear actually stumbled from the unexpected blow, but it also had the effect of redirecting the bear's attention from Jake to Elena, which was exactly what Jake had been trying to prevent. The grizzly spun toward Elena with a speed that belied its massive size, rising up on its hind legs to its full 8-foot height. Elena raised the branch again, but they both knew it would be inadequate against the bear's next attack. That's when Jake found reserves of strength he didn't know he possessed. Ignoring the fire in his ribs and the grinding pain in his shoulder, Jake launched himself at the bear's legs, hitting the massive animal with a tackle that would have made his high school football coach proud. The impact knocked the bear off balance, sending it crashing back to all fours. But it also put Jake directly underneath 600 pounds of enraged predator. The bear's response was immediate and devastating. It drove its head down toward Jake's prone form, jaws open wide enough to crush a human skull like an eggshell. Jake rolled desperately to one side, and the bear's teeth snapped shut on empty air where his head had been a fraction of a second earlier. Jake kept rolling, trying to get out from under the bear's massive body, but one of its paws caught him across the back, claws raking through his shirt and into flesh. The pain was extraordinary, but adrenaline kept him moving. He managed to get to his knees just as the bear swung its head toward him again. This time Jake was ready. He drove his hunting knife upward with every ounce of strength in his body, aiming for the soft tissue under the bear's jaw. The blade went in deep, and the bear's roar turned into something between a scream and a gurgle. But the wound, while serious, was not immediately fatal, and Jake's knife was now stuck in the bear's throat. The bear reared back, pawing at its neck, trying to dislodge the knife. Blood was flowing freely from the wound, but the animal was far from finished. If anything, the pain seemed to make it more dangerous, more desperate. Eleanor seized the moment of distraction to grab a large stone from the creek bed. She hurled it with the accuracy of someone who had grown up hunting small game in the Montana wilderness, striking the bear squarely between the eyes. The impact staggered the massive animal, but it also focused its rage on Elena once again. The bear charged toward her with blood streaming from its throat and madness in its small dark eyes. Elena had nowhere to run. Her daughters were directly behind her, and the bear was moving faster than any human could hope to match. She spread her arms wide, as if she could somehow shield Lily and Rose with her own body, and prepared to die protecting the two most precious things in her world. That's when Dakota entered the fight. Jake's horse had been circling the clearing during the battle, too well trained to flee, but too intelligent to get involved in a fight between predators. But when she saw the bear charging toward Elena and the children, some deep instinct kicked in. Dakota came thundering across the clearing like a force of nature, her hooves striking the ground with the power of a sledgehammer. She caught the bear in mid-charge with a blow from her front hooves that lifted the massive predator completely off the ground. The bear crashed into a cluster of saplings with enough force to snap several of them like matchsticks. For a moment, it lay still, stunned by the unexpected attack from an animal it had not considered a threat. Jake used that moment to retrieve a fallen branch nearly as thick as his torso. The bear was beginning to stir, shaking its massive head as it tried to regain its bearings. Blood from Jake's knife wound was making a dark puddle beneath its neck, but it was still very much alive and dangerous. As the bear struggled to its feet, Jake brought the branch down on its skull with every remaining ounce of his strength. The impact sent shockwaves up his arms and drove the bear back to the ground. But still it was not finished. The grizzly's breathing was becoming labored, and its movements were slower, but it continued to try to rise. Jake raised the branch again, prepared to deliver another blow, when Elena's voice stopped him. "Jake, look!" The bear had finally managed to get back to its feet, but something had changed. The murderous rage in its eyes had been replaced by something that looked almost like confusion. Blood was flowing more freely from the knife wound in its throat, and its breathing had become rapid and shallow. For a long moment, bear and human stared at each other across the clearing. Jake kept the branch raised, ready to strike again if necessary, while Elena pulled her daughters close behind her. Even Dakota seemed to sense that the deadly confrontation was entering a new phase. The bear took a step backward, then another. Its legs seemed unsteady, and Jake realized that his knife had severed something vital in the animal's throat. The bear was dying, but it was still dangerous enough to kill them all if it chose to make one final charge. Instead, the massive grizzly turned and began walking slowly toward the tree line. Its gait was uneven, and it paused several times to rest, but its intent was clear. It was leaving the clearing. "Should we follow it?" Elena whispered. Jake shook his head. "Let it go. It's looking for a place to die, and we don't want to provoke another attack." They watched in tense silence as the bear disappeared into the forest. Even after it was out of sight, they could hear it moving through the underbrush, the sounds growing fainter as the wounded animal sought solitude for its final moments. Only when the forest had been silent for several minutes did Jake allow himself to collapse to his knees. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the fight was beginning to wear off, and the full extent of his injuries was becoming apparent. Elena was beside him in an instant, her hands gently probing the claw marks across his ribs and back. "We need to get you to a hospital," she said, though they both knew the nearest medical facility was over an hour away. "I'll be fine," Jake said, though the pain in his shoulder suggested otherwise. "Are you and the girls hurt?" "We're okay," Elena assured him, though her voice was shaking with the delayed shock of what they'd just survived. "Jake, what you did? There aren't any words." Lily and Rose approached cautiously, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. Rose reached out and gently touched one of the tears in Jake's shirt, where the bear's claws had raked across his back. "Does it hurt?" she asked in a small voice. "Not too much," Jake lied, managing a smile for the little girl who had become so precious to him. Elena began tearing strips from her own shirt to bandage Jake's wounds as best she could. The cuts were deep but not life-threatening, and his shoulder appeared to be strained rather than dislocated. He would need proper medical attention, but he was in no immediate danger. As Elena worked, Jake found himself studying her face in the fading afternoon light. Her hands were steady despite everything they'd been through, and there was something in her dark eyes that hadn't been there before. A look of complete trust and something deeper that made his heart race despite his injuries. "Why did you come back for us?" she asked quietly, focused on wrapping a makeshift bandage around his ribs. "Because you matter to me," Jake said simply. "All three of you matter more than I knew how to say." Elena's hands stilled in their work, and she looked up to meet his eyes. "Jake, I know it's complicated," he said quickly. "I know you're still healing from Michael's death, and I know I'm just a ranch hand who doesn't have much to offer. But what I feel for you, for your girls, it's real. It's the most real thing I've ever experienced." Elena was quiet for a long moment, her fingers still resting gently on his bandaged ribs. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "When I saw that bear going after you, when I thought I might lose you, I realized that I've been hiding from something I've felt for weeks now. Maybe months." She looked up at him again, and this time there were tears in her eyes. "I've been so afraid of caring about someone again, of letting my daughters care about someone again. But Jake, what you did today, you risked your life for us. You fought a grizzly bear with nothing but a knife because you couldn't bear the thought of us getting hurt." Jake reached out with his good arm and gently touched her face, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped to roll down her cheek. "I would do it again," he said softly. "I would do anything to keep you safe." Elena leaned into his touch, and for a moment the forest around them seemed to fade away. There was only this man who had proven his love for her family in the most dramatic way possible, and the realization that her heart had already made a choice, her mind had been too fearful to acknowledge. "We should get you home," she said finally, though she made no move to pull away from his gentle touch. "Elena," Jake said, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion, "when we get through this, when I'm healed up and things settle down, I want to talk about the future, about what this could mean for all of us." Elena smiled through her tears, the first genuine smile Jake had seen from her since the terror began. "I'd like that," she said. "I'd like that very much," as they helped each other to their feet and began the slow journey back toward the ranch. None of them noticed the massive form lying still in the shadows beneath the pines 50 yards away. The great bear had found its resting place at last, and the forest was beginning to reclaim its peace. But for Jake Morrison and Elena Clearwater, the real story was just beginning. The journey back to the ranch took nearly 2 hours, with Jake riding Dakota while Elena and the girls walked alongside them. Every step was agony for Jake, but he insisted on staying mounted to keep watch for any other wildlife that might pose a threat. The forest seemed different now. Every shadow could hide another predator. Every sound could signal a new danger. As they emerged from the tree line into the open pastures of Whispering Pines Ranch, Tom Brennan was waiting for them in his pickup truck. The elderly ranch owner had grown worried when Jake failed to return from his ride, and Dakota's tracks had led him toward the forest. "Jesus Christ, what happened to you?" Tom demanded, taking in Jake's blood-soaked shirt and Elena's makeshift bandages. "Grizzly bear," Jake said simply, sliding carefully down from Dakota's back. "Big one." Elena and the girls were trapped, and it got between them and home. Tom's weathered face went pale. "Grizzly? There haven't been grizzlies in this valley for 15 years. "There is now," Elena said quietly. "Or was. Jake killed it." Tom looked from Jake's obvious injuries to Elena's fierce expression and the wide-eyed faces of her daughters. "Get in the truck, all of you. We're going to the hospital in Kalispell." "I don't need a hospital," Jake protested, though his voice lacked conviction. "Like hell you don't," Tom shot back. "Those claw marks need proper cleaning and stitching, and you might have internal injuries. Elena, help me get him in the truck bed. The drive to Kalispell Regional Medical Center was a blur of winding mountain roads and gathering dusk. Elena sat in the truck bed with Jake, holding pressure on his wounds, while Lily and Rose huddled close to their mother in the confined space. Tom drove with the urgency of a man who had seen too many ranch accidents go from manageable to tragic because someone was too stubborn to seek proper medical care. At the hospital, Jake was whisked away to the emergency room while Elena provided what details she could to the triage nurse. She found herself struggling to explain exactly what had happened. The story sounded almost fictional, even to her own ears. A grizzly bear attacked your family and this man fought it off with a knife. The nurse asked, clearly skeptical. That's exactly what happened, Elena said firmly. If you don't believe me, you can call the Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks office. They'll want to investigate anyway. Dr. Sarah Hendricks, the emergency room physician who treated Jake, had seen plenty of unusual injuries during her 15 years practicing medicine in rural Montana. But she'd never treated anyone who had survived a grizzly bear attack, much less someone who had been the aggressor in such an encounter. You're incredibly lucky, she told Jake, as she cleaned and sutured the deep claw marks across his ribs. These wounds could have been fatal if they'd been just a few inches to the left. How long before I can get back to work? Jake asked, wincing as the doctor worked. Work? Mr. Morrison, you need at least 2 weeks of rest before you even think about any kind of physical labor. These wounds need time to heal properly, and you've lost a significant amount of blood. Jake started to protest, but Elena's voice from the corner of the room cut him off. He'll rest, she said with an authority that surprised everyone, including herself. I'll make sure of it, Dr. Hendricks smiled. Good. He'll need someone to keep an eye on him for the first few days. Change the bandages twice daily, watch for signs of infection, and bring him back immediately if there's any unusual swelling or discharge. After Jake was released with a prescription for antibiotics and pain medication, Tom drove them back to the ranch in thoughtful silence. The events of the day had shaken the old rancher more than he cared to admit. In 40 years of managing cattle and horses in Montana wilderness, he'd never encountered anything as dangerous as what Jake and Elena had faced. Jake, he said as they pulled up to the main ranch house, you're staying in the guest room until those wounds heal. I don't want you alone in the bunkhouse if you have complications. Tom, I appreciate the offer, but it's not an offer, Tom interrupted. It's an order. And Elena, I want you and the girls to stay here too, at least for tonight. If there was one grizzly in the area, there might be others. Elena looked at her daughters, who had been unusually quiet during the entire ordeal. The idea of spending the night in their isolated cabin after what they'd experienced was admittedly terrifying. We'll stay, she decided, just for tonight. Tom's ranch house was spacious and comfortable, built in the classic Western style with log walls and stone fireplaces. He showed Elena and the girls to a guest room with 2 double beds, while Jake was settled in the room across the hall. As evening settled over the ranch, Elena found herself in Tom's kitchen, preparing a simple dinner, while the girls played quietly in the living room. The normal domestic activity helped calm her nerves, though her hands still shook slightly when she thought about how close they'd all come to dying in those woods. "Mama," Rose said, appearing at her elbow, "is Jake going to be okay?" "He's going to be fine, sweetheart," Eleanor assured her daughter, though she could hear the uncertainty in her own voice. "He saved us, didn't he?" Lily asked, joining her sister in the kitchen doorway. Elena stopped stirring the soup she was heating and looked at her daughters. Really looked at them. They'd witnessed violence and terror that most adults never experienced, yet they seemed to be processing it with a resilience that both amazed and worried her. "Yes," she said simply. "Jake saved all of us. Does that mean he loves us?" Rose asked, with the directness that only 6-year-olds possess. Elena felt her throat tighten with emotion. "I think it does, baby. I think it means he loves us very much." After dinner, Tom excused himself to his office to call the wildlife authorities and report the bear attack. Elena helped her daughters get ready for bed, then found herself standing outside Jake's room. Uncertain whether to knock, The decision was made for her when Jake opened the door, wearing only jeans and the bandages that covered his torso. In the soft light from the hallway, Eleanor could see the full extent of his injuries for the first time. Angry red claw marks that would leave permanent scars, bruising that covered half his back, and the careful way he held his left shoulder. "How are you feeling?" she asked softly. "Like I've been hit by a truck," Jake admitted with a rueful smile. "But alive, which is more than I expected a few hours ago." Eleanor stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. "Jake, we need to talk about what happened today. Not just the bear attack, but what we said to each other afterward." Jake moved carefully to the bed and sat down, patting the space beside him in invitation. Elena joined him, careful not to jar his injuries. "I meant every word," Jake said without hesitation. "I know it might seem like the adrenaline talking or some kind of emotional reaction to what we went through, but it's not. What I feel for you, for Lily and Rose, it's been building for months." Elena was quiet for a moment, her hands folded in her lap as she struggled to find the right words. "When Michael died," she began slowly, "I thought that part of my life was over. I thought I'd never feel that way about anyone again, and honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to. Loving someone, building a life with them, it makes you vulnerable. It gives you so much to lose." Jake reached over and gently took her hand. "I understand. I've spent most of my adult life avoiding exactly those kinds of attachments. But today, when I saw that bear going after you," Eleanor's voice broke slightly, "I realized I'd already made the choice to love you, whether I admitted it to myself or not. The thought of losing you was unbearable." Jake lifted their joined hands and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Where does that leave us?" Elena turned to face him fully, her dark eyes serious but no longer afraid. "I think it leaves us figuring out how to build something together. How to blend your life with ours in a way that works for everyone, especially the girls. They're amazing kids," Jake said softly. "Smart, brave, kind. They're a credit to you, Elena. Being part of their lives would be an honor, not a burden." Elena felt tears prick at her eyes again. "They've already started thinking of you as family, you know. Rose asked me tonight if you saving us meant you loved us. What did you tell her?" "The truth. That I think you do." Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying Elena's face in the dim light. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I've never had a family of my own. My parents died when I was young, and I've been drifting from ranch to ranch ever since. I never thought I'd find a place where I belonged, people who mattered enough to fight for." Elena shifted closer to him on the bed, careful of his injuries. "You belong here, Jake, with us. Today proved that beyond any doubt." Jake reached up with his good arm and gently cupped her face. "Elena, I want to do this right. I want to court you properly, spend time with the girls, prove that I can be the kind of man you all deserve." Elena leaned into his touch, closing her eyes at the tenderness in his voice. "You've already proven that, but I appreciate that you want to take things slow, build something solid." "I love you," Jake said simply. "I love all three of you, and I want to spend the rest of my life showing you how much." Elena opened her eyes and looked at him with an expression of such warmth and acceptance that Jake felt his heart swell almost to bursting. "I love you too," she whispered. "More than I thought I could ever love anyone again." Jake leaned forward slowly, giving Elena time to pull away if she wanted to. Instead, she met him halfway, their lips coming together in a kiss that was gentle and sweet and full of promise for the future they were choosing to build together. When they finally broke apart, Elena rested her forehead against his, both of them breathing slightly unsteadily. "We should probably get some sleep," she said reluctantly. "You need to rest, and tomorrow is going to be complicated. The wildlife officers will want statements, and Tom will probably have reporters calling once word gets out about the bear attack." Jake nodded, though he was reluctant to let her go. "Will you stay? Just until I fall asleep? I keep thinking about what could have happened if things had gone differently." Elena settled carefully beside him on the bed, mindful of his injuries. Jake turned onto his good side so he could see her face, and Elena reached out to smooth a lock of hair back from his forehead. "Sleep," she said softly. "I'll be right here." As Jake's breathing gradually evened out into the rhythm of sleep, Elena allowed herself to really process everything that had changed in the course of a single afternoon. This morning, she'd been a widowed mother trying to raise her daughters alone, carefully guarding her heart against the possibility of love and loss. Tonight, she was a woman who had found someone worth loving again, someone who had proven his devotion in the most dramatic way possible. The future was full of unknowns, practical questions about where they would live, how to blend their lives, what their relationship would look like as it developed. But for the first time since Michael's death, Elena felt genuine hope about what lay ahead. She had found a man who loved her daughters as if they were his own, who would literally fight bears to protect them, who understood the importance of family and home and building something lasting. As she watched Jake sleep, Elena made a silent promise to herself and to the man beside her. She would not let fear dictate her choices anymore. She would not hold back from love because of the possibility of loss. Life was too short and too precious to waste on anything but authentic connection and genuine happiness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, reporters, wildlife officers, the practical matter of dealing with Jake's injuries, and her own emotional processing of the trauma they'd experienced. But tonight, she was exactly where she belonged, beside the man who had proven his love for her family in the most elemental way possible. Outside the ranch house, the Montana wilderness stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars. Somewhere in those dark forests, the story of their bear encounter would become legend, passed down through generations of ranch hands and local families. But inside the warm circle of lamplight, two people who had found each other against all odds were beginning to write a different kind of story, one of love and family and the courage to build something beautiful from the raw materials, of chance and choice. Eleanor drifted off to sleep with Jake's hand in hers, their breathing synchronized and their hearts finally at peace with the love they'd discovered in each other. 3 weeks after the bear attack, Jake was finally cleared by Dr. Hendricks to return to light duty around the ranch. The claw marks across his ribs had healed into raised pink scars that would fade with time, and his shoulder had regained most of its mobility. More importantly, the emotional bonds forged in those terrifying moments in the forest had only grown stronger during his recovery. Elena had insisted on caring for Jake personally during his convalescence, despite Tom's protests that he could hire a nurse. She'd moved herself and the girls into the main ranch house temporarily, creating an unexpectedly harmonious household that surprised everyone with how naturally it functioned. "You realize what you're doing, don't you?" Tom asked Elena one morning as she prepared Jake's breakfast with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing it for years rather than weeks. "Making sure he eats properly and takes his medication." Elena replied, though she knew that wasn't what Tom meant. "You're playing house," Tom said with a knowing smile. "And doing a damn fine job of it, if you ask me." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't deny it. The past 3 weeks had shown her what life could be like with Jake, as more than just a friend who stopped by for Sunday dinners. She'd watched him read bedtime stories to Rose and help Lily with her homework. She'd seen him patiently teach both girls how to braid rope and identify different types of wildflowers. Most tellingly, she'd observed how naturally they'd all fallen into the rhythms of a real family. "Tom," she said carefully, "what would you think if we decided to make this arrangement more permanent?" Tom leaned back in his kitchen chair and studied her with the shrewd eyes that had helped him build one of the most successful ranches in northern Montana. "I'd think it was about time," he said finally. "Jake's the best ranch hand I've had in 20 years, and you're the finest woman I know. If you two can find happiness together, especially after what you've been through, then you have my blessing and any help you need to make it work." Elena felt a rush of gratitude toward the elderly rancher who had become like a father to her since Michael's death. There might be practical complications. Where we'd live, how to handle the ranch work, the girls' schooling, details, Tom waved dismissively. We'll figure out the details. The important thing is that you're both sure about what you want. That afternoon, as Jake sat on the front porch, testing his shoulder's range of motion, Elena approached him with a determined expression that immediately caught his attention. "We need to talk," she said. Settling into the chair beside him, Jake's heart jumped, though he tried to keep his expression neutral. "That sounds ominous." "Not ominous," Elena assured him quickly. "Important. Jake, these past 3 weeks, they've shown me things I needed to see about what we could have together." Jake turned to face her fully, his blue eyes serious. "What kinds of things?" "How naturally you fit into our lives. How good you are with the girls. How right it feels to take care of you, to have you be part of our daily routines." Elena paused, gathering her courage for what she wanted to say next. "Jake, I want to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Always." Elena took a deep breath. "Do you want to marry me?" Jake's eyes went wide with surprise. In all his imaginings about how this conversation might go, he'd never pictured Elena being the one to bring up marriage. "Elena, I know it might seem sudden," she rushed on, "but what we went through in those woods, it stripped away all the pretense and fear and uncertainty. We've already chosen each other in the most fundamental way possible. The legal ceremony would just be making it official." Jake reached over and took her hands in his, marveling at how small and delicate they felt, despite the strength he knew they possessed. "Elena Clearwater," he said solemnly, "I would marry you tomorrow if you'd have me. I'd marry you today if we could find someone to perform the ceremony. The question is whether you're ready for everything that would mean." "What do you mean?" Jake was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Marrying me means taking on a ranch hand's life. It means uncertainty about income, long hours during calving season, and winters that can be harsh and isolating. It means your daughters will grow up as ranch kids, with all the responsibilities and limitations that entails." Elena smiled at his concern for her welfare. "Jake, I grew up on a reservation in Montana. I understand hard work and uncertain income and harsh winters. And as for the girls, look at them." Jake followed her gaze to where Lily and Rose were playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the afternoon breeze. In the week since the bear attack, both girls had grown more confident and adventurous, as if surviving that ordeal had proven to them that they could handle whatever life threw at them. "They're thriving here," Elena continued. "They love the animals, they love the wide open spaces, and they love you. This life, this place, it's already home to all of us." Jake brought her hands to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "In that case, Elena Clearwater, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life loving you and your daughters and building something beautiful together?" Elena's smile was radiant. "Yes, Jake Morrison. 1,000 times, yes." Their engagement was celebrated that evening with a simple dinner featuring Tom's best whiskey and a chocolate cake that Elena and the girls had baked in secret earlier that afternoon. The elderly rancher raised his glass in a toast that brought tears to everyone's eyes. "To Jake and Elena," he said, "who proved that the best things in life are worth fighting for, even when the odds seem impossible." Planning a wedding in rural Montana during late autumn presented unique challenges, but Elena and Jake were determined to keep things simple and meaningful. They decided on a ceremony at the small community church in nearby Whitefish, followed by a reception at the ranch that would include all their friends and neighbors. The month leading up to the wedding flew by in a whirlwind of preparations and adjustments. Jake moved his few belongings from the bunkhouse into Elena's cabin, which Tom had generously expanded with an additional bedroom and a larger kitchen. Elena's mother, Mary Clearwater, traveled from the Crow Reservation to help with wedding preparations and to finally meet the man who had captured her daughter's heart. Mary was a formidable woman in her 70s, with silver hair braided down her back and dark eyes that seemed to see everything. She spent her first day at the ranch observing Jake without comment, watching how he interacted with Elena and her granddaughters. "He's not Cherokee," she finally said to Elena as they prepared dinner together. "No, Mama, he's not," Elena replied calmly. But he's a good man who loves us and protects us and treats us with respect. Mary continued chopping vegetables in silence for several minutes. Your father was not Cherokee either, she said eventually. But he learned our ways, honored our traditions, raised you to know who you are and where you come from. Elena looked up from the bread she was kneading. Are you saying you approve? I'm saying that love is not about blood or tribal membership, Mary replied. It's about finding someone who sees your worth and helps you become the best version of yourself. This Jake, he does that for you. That evening, Mary approached Jake as he sat on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Jake Morrison, she said, settling into the chair beside him, my daughter tells me you want to marry her. Yes, ma'am, Jake replied respectfully. More than anything, and you understand that when you marry Elena, you're not just taking a wife. You're becoming part of a family that includes 2 Cherokee girls who will need to learn their heritage and understand their place in both worlds. Jake considered this seriously before answering. Mrs. Clearwater, I can't teach Lily and Rose about Cherokee traditions because I don't know them myself. But I can make sure they have opportunities to learn, that they stay connected to their culture and their people. And I can love them and support them as they figure out who they want to be. Mary studied his face in the fading light. What if they ask you about their father someday? About the man they lost? Then I'll tell them everything I know about Michael Clearwater, Jake said without hesitation. I'll tell them how much he loved them and their mother, how proud he would be of the young women they're becoming. I'll never try to replace him in their hearts or their memories. Mary nodded slowly. You are a wise man, Jake Morrison. Elena has chosen well. The wedding took place on a crisp November morning, with the first snow of the season dusting the peaks of the surrounding mountains. Erdena wore a simple white dress that had belonged to her grandmother, altered by Mary to incorporate traditional Cherokee beadwork around the neckline and sleeves. Jake wore his best suit, a string tie, and the silver belt buckle that had belonged to his father. Lily and Rose served as flower girls, walking down the aisle with baskets of late-blooming wildflowers that Elena had preserved from their creekside gathering place. Tom Brennan walked Elena down the aisle, his pride evident in every step. The ceremony itself was a beautiful blend of traditional Christian vows and Cherokee customs that Mary had suggested. Elena and Jake exchanged rings made by a local silversmith from Silver Mine in the Montana mountains, and they participated in a blessing ritual that honored the 4 directions and asked for guidance from the spirits of the land. Jake Morrison, the minister said, as the ceremony neared its conclusion, do you promise to love, honor, and protect Elena and her daughters for all the days of your life? I do, Jake replied, his voice strong and certain. Elena Clearwater Morrison, the minister continued, do you promise to love, honor, and support Jake through whatever challenges life may bring? I do, Elena said, tears of joy streaming down her face. Then by the power vested in me and with the blessing of this community, I pronounce you husband and wife. Jake, you may kiss your bride. Jake's kiss was gentle and reverent, a promise sealed in front of everyone who mattered to them. As they broke apart, Lily and Rose rushed forward to hug their new stepfather, completing the picture of a family that had been forged in crisis and blessed by love. The reception at the ranch was a celebration that lasted well into the evening. Local musicians provided entertainment. Elena's mother shared stories about Cherokee wedding traditions, and Tom delivered a speech that had everyone laughing and crying in equal measure. I've seen a lot of partnerships form and dissolve over the years, he told the assembled guests. But I've never seen 2 people more perfectly suited for each other than Jake and Elena. They've already proven they can face the worst that life has to offer and come through it stronger. I have no doubt they'll build something beautiful together. As the evening wound down and the guests began to depart, Jake and Elena found themselves alone on the front porch of what was now officially their shared home. The cabin that had once sheltered a grieving widow and her daughters had been transformed into the foundation of a new family built on love, respect, and unshakable commitment. No regrets? Jake asked, pulling Elena close against the November chill. Only one, Elena replied, looking up at him with sparkling eyes. Jake's heart skipped a beat. What's that? Elena smiled and stood on her tiptoes to whisper in his ear. I wish we could have met sooner. Think of all the time we could have had together. Jake laughed and spun her around, both of them giddy with happiness and the promise of all the years stretching ahead of them. Inside the cabin, Lily and Rose were already asleep, exhausted by the excitement of the day, but secure in the knowledge that their family was complete at last. Their mother had found love again, and they had gained a father who would protect them and guide them and love them unconditionally. Outside, the Montana wilderness stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars, holding the same beauty and danger it had always possessed. But for the Morrison family, that wilderness was no longer a source of fear or uncertainty. It was home, and they would face whatever it brought together as a family united by bonds stronger than blood and deeper than the roots of the ancient pines that surrounded their valley. The ranch hand had indeed found his reward, not just in Elena's love, but in the complete transformation of his solitary existence into something rich and meaningful and full of purpose. And Elena had discovered that the heart could love again, even after loss, even after fear, even after believing that such happiness was no longer possible. Together, they would build a legacy that would endure long after the story of their bear encounter had become the stuff of local legend, a legacy of love, courage, and the unshakable belief that some things are indeed worth fighting for. 2 years after their wedding, Jake Morrison stood in the doorway of the expanded cabin, watching his wife Elena nurse their 3-month-old son, Samuel Michael Morrison. The baby had been named for Jake's grandfather and Elena's late husband, a gesture that honored both their pasts while celebrating their future together. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows, illuminating a scene of domestic tranquility that still amazed Jake with its simple perfection. Lily, now 10, was helping Rose, 8, pack their school lunches while debating the merits of different sandwich combinations. The girls had adapted to their roles as big sisters with enthusiasm, though they still occasionally competed for the privilege of holding baby Sam. Papa Jake, Rose said, using the name she'd chosen for him shortly after the wedding. Can we take Sam to the creek today after school? I want to show him the pollywogs. Jake smiled at the eagerness in her voice. Sam's still a little young for creek expeditions, sweetheart. But maybe in a few months when the weather gets warmer. By then he'll be crawling, Lily pointed out with the practical wisdom of her 10 years. Mom says crawling babies get into everything. Elena looked up from nursing Sam, her dark eyes sparkling with amusement. Lily's right. We'll have our hands full once Sam starts moving around. Jake moved into the kitchen and dropped a kiss on the top of Elena's head before pouring himself coffee from the pot she'd prepared earlier. The routine was so natural now that he sometimes forgot there had ever been a time when this wasn't his life, when he'd been a solitary drifter moving from ranch to ranch with no one to care about except himself. Tom wants me to ride the north pastures. Today, he told Elena, check on the new calves and make sure the wolves haven't been causing problems. Elena nodded, though a shadow of concern crossed her face. She'd never quite gotten over her fear of Jake venturing alone into the wilderness, even though they both knew that grizzly bear encounters were extremely rare. The Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Service had conducted extensive surveys after their attack and confirmed that the bear Jake had killed had been a lone male, likely driven down from Canada by territorial disputes with other bears. Take the radio, she said, as she always did when he planned to work in remote areas. And check in every 2 hours. Jake had long since stopped protesting these precautions. He understood that Elena's concern came from love, and honestly, he enjoyed having someone worry about his safety after years of living with no one who would notice if he failed to return home. As he prepared to leave for his day's work, Jake reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since that September afternoon, when he'd charged into a forest clearing to save a Cherokee woman and her 2 daughters. The bear attack had certainly been the catalyst, but the real transformation had come in the months and years that followed. As he'd learned what it meant to be part of a family, Tom Brennan had been true to his word about helping them work out the practical details of their life together. He'd officially promoted Jake to ranch foreman, a position that came with increased responsibility and significantly better pay. More importantly, Tom had begun talking about his succession plans, hinting broadly that he'd like to see Jake and Elena eventually take over the operation of Whispering Pines Ranch. "I'm not getting any younger," Tom had said just the week before, "and I'd rather see this place go to people who understand what it means, who'll preserve what we've built here." The prospect of actually owning the ranch was still almost too wonderful for Jake to fully believe. He'd spent so many years as hired help, never imagining he could accumulate enough money or stability to own property of his own. But Elena had encouraged him to start thinking seriously about Tom's offer, pointing out that they'd proven their ability to manage both the land and the livestock. "You've earned this," she'd told him, "not just through your work, but through your character. Tom trusts you because you've shown him who you are." As Jake saddled Dakota for the day's ride, he found himself thinking about the conversation he and Elena had been having more frequently lately about expanding their family beyond Sam. Elena wanted more children, and Jake discovered that the idea of raising a house full of kids in the Montana wilderness appealed to him enormously. "I never thought I'd be the kind of man who wanted a big family," he confessed to Elena one evening as they watched their 3 children playing in the yard. "But now I can't imagine anything better than filling this place with the sound of children's laughter." Eleanor had smiled and taken his hand. "We have time to decide. Sam's still so little, and the girls are growing up so fast. Let's see how we handle 3 before we commit to more." The ride to the North Pastures took Jake through some of the most beautiful country in Montana. Spring was beginning to assert itself in the high valleys, with wildflowers starting to bloom and the aspens showing the first tender green of new leaves. It was the kind of landscape that had drawn him west in the first place, though he'd never imagined he'd find a way to call any of it truly home. As he rode, Jake's thoughts turned to Lily and Rose, and how well they'd adapted to having him as their stepfather. Both girls had retained strong connections to their Cherokee heritage through regular visits with Elena's mother and participation in tribal cultural events. But they'd also embraced ranch life with enthusiasm. Lily had developed a particular talent for working with horses, showing an intuitive understanding of animal behavior that reminded Jake of Elena's natural grace with all living things. Rose was more interested in the business side of ranching, already asking sophisticated questions about cattle prices and feed costs that amazed the adults around her. "They're going to make fine ranchers someday," Tom had observed. If that's what they choose to do, Jake hoped they would choose to stay. But he and Elena were both committed to giving the girls whatever education and opportunities they needed to make their own decisions about their futures. Elena had returned to school herself, taking online courses in business management that would help her contribute more effectively to the ranch's operations. "I want to be your partner in every sense of the word," she'd explained when she'd first proposed going back to school. "Not just your wife, but your business partner. Your intellectual equal in all the decisions we'll have to make." The North Pastures were peaceful that morning, with the new calves staying close to their mothers and no sign of predator activity. Jake spent several hours checking fence lines and water sources, the kind of routine maintenance work that kept a ranch operation running smoothly. It was satisfying work, especially when he considered that he was no longer just maintaining someone else's property, but potentially preparing for his own future ownership. Around noon, Jake stopped beside a small stream to eat the lunch Elena had packed for him and to give Dakota a chance to rest and graze. As he sat on a fallen log eating Elena's homemade bread and thinking about the afternoon's tasks, his radio crackled to life. Jake, this is Elena. How are things looking up there? Jake smiled at the sound of her voice. Everything's quiet. The calves all look healthy, and I haven't seen any sign of wolves. How's Sam doing? He's been fussy all morning, but he finally went down for a nap. I think he's starting to have teeth, poor little guy. I'll try to get home early to help with the evening routine. No hurry, Elena replied. Take the time you need to do the job right. We'll be here when you get back. That simple exchange, so ordinary and domestic, filled Jake with a contentment he'd never experienced before marriage. The knowledge that Elena and the children were waiting for him at home transformed even routine ranch work into something meaningful, something connected to a larger purpose than just earning wages. As the afternoon wore on, Jake found himself in an increasingly contemplative mood. The anniversary of the bear attack was approaching, and he'd been thinking about how that single day had changed the trajectory of multiple lives. Elena had mentioned wanting to return to the creek where it had all happened, not as a traumatic pilgrimage, but as a way of acknowledging how far they'd all come. I want the girls to see that place not as somewhere terrible happened, but as where our real family began, she'd explained. Where you proved that you loved us enough to risk everything. Jake understood her impulse, though he still had mixed feelings about revisiting the site of such violence. The physical scars from the bear's claws had faded to thin white lines across his ribs and back, but the emotional impact of that confrontation remained vivid. Sometimes he still woke from dreams where he was fighting the massive grizzly again, though now the dreams usually ended with Elena's voice calling him back to safety rather than with the terror of potential loss. Dr. Hendricks, who had become something of a family friend, had explained that such dreams were normal for people who had survived traumatic events. Your mind is processing the experience, integrating it into your life story in a way that allows you to move forward, she'd said. The fact that the dreams now include Elena's voice suggests that you're healing, that you found a way to transform the trauma into something positive. As Jake began the ride back toward the ranch, he passed through the valley where Elena's cabin had originally stood. Tom had converted the building into a storage facility after they'd moved into the expanded main house. But Jake still felt a sentimental attachment to the place where he'd first realized he was falling in love with Elena and her daughters. The evening routine at the Morrison household had evolved into a well-choreographed dance of family activities. Elena would start dinner while Jake helped the girls with homework and fed the horses. After dinner, they'd all pitch in with cleanup before settling into the living room for whatever evening entertainment had been planned, sometimes reading, sometimes board games, sometimes just conversation about the day's events. Tonight, however, Elena had a surprise waiting when Jake returned from the north pastures. "Pack a bag," she announced as he walked through the front door. "We're going camping this weekend." Jake raised an eyebrow. "All of us." "Even Sam." "Especially Sam," Elena grinned. "It's time for his first real wilderness adventure. And I've talked to Tom. He's given you the weekend off." Lily and Rose bounced excitedly around the kitchen. "Mama says we're going to sleep under the stars," Rose exclaimed, "and cook over a campfire," Lily added. "And maybe see some elk." Jake looked at Eleanor with a mixture of admiration and slight concern. "Where exactly are we planning to camp?" Elena's smile became more serious. "Beaver Creek. I want to go back there, Jake. Not to relive what happened, but to reclaim that place as somewhere beautiful instead of somewhere frightening." Jake understood immediately. Elena was choosing to confront her fears head-on, to transform a site of trauma into a place of family joy. It was exactly the kind of brave, practical decision he'd come to expect from his wife. "It's a good idea," he said, pulling her into his arms. "Sam should know all the places that are important to our family's story." That weekend's camping trip became one of the most meaningful experiences the Morrison family had shared since their wedding. They pitched their tents beside the same creek where Elena and the girls had played 2 years earlier, and Jake was amazed to discover that the location now felt peaceful rather than threatening. Lily and Rose showed baby Sam the pollywogs in the creek, just as Rose had promised months earlier. Elena collected wildflowers for a bouquet she planned to press and frame as a reminder of their triumph over fear. Jake taught the girls how to build a proper campfire and told them stories about the wildlife that lived in the surrounding forests. On their last evening at the creek, as they sat around the campfire with Sam sleeping peacefully in Elena's arms, Lily asked the question they'd all been thinking about. "Papa Jake, are you glad the bear attacked us?" Jake considered his answer carefully. "I'm not glad about the danger you were all in, or about anyone getting hurt. But I'm grateful for what happened afterward, for the way it brought us all together. Do you think we would have become a family anyway?" Rose asked with the intensity of her 8 years. Elena and Jake exchanged glances over the flickering firelight. "I think we were already becoming a family," Elena said softly. "The bear attack just helped us realize it faster." Jake nodded in agreement. "Sometimes it takes a crisis to show us what really matters. For me, that crisis proved that I'd found the most important thing in the world, people worth protecting, worth building a life with." As they prepared for bed that final night at Beaver Creek, Jake reflected on the strange turns that life could take. 2 years ago, he'd been a solitary ranch hand with no permanent attachments and no vision of the future beyond the next job. Now he was a husband, a father to 3 children, and potentially the next owner of one of Montana's most successful ranches. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Learning to balance his independent nature with the needs of a family had required adjustments he'd never anticipated. There had been difficult conversations about money, about child-rearing philosophies, about how to honor Elena's Cherokee heritage while building something new together. But every challenge had been worth overcoming for the sake of what they'd built together. Jake had discovered that the reward for risking everything wasn't just Elena's love, but the complete reconstruction of his identity from a man with nothing to lose into someone with everything worth protecting. As he drifted off to sleep beside his wife and children under the vast Montana sky, Jake Morrison understood that he'd found something most people spent their entire lives searching for, a place where he belonged completely, people who loved him unconditionally, and a purpose that gave meaning to every day he was privileged to live. The ranch hand's reward had indeed been beyond anything he could have imagined when he'd charged into that forest, clearing with nothing but courage and a determination to protect the people who had somehow become his whole world. 5 years had passed since that fateful September day when Jake Morrison's life changed forever. Now, as he stood on the wraparound porch of the house he and Eleanor had built together, watching his children play in the yard below, he could barely recognize the solitary drifter he'd once been. The original cabin had been transformed into guest quarters for Eleanor's mother during her frequent visits. In its place stood a beautiful log home that Jake and Eleanor had designed together, incorporating both practical ranch needs and Cherokee architectural elements that honored Elena's heritage. Solar panels gleamed on the roof, and a large garden provided fresh vegetables for their growing family. Sam, now 5 years old, was chasing chickens around the yard, while his 2-year-old sister, Anna, toddled after him on unsteady legs. Lily, at 15, had grown into a confident young woman who could handle horses better than most adult ranch hands. Rose, 13, had inherited her mother's head for business and was already talking about studying agricultural economics in college. "Papa!" Anna called out, spotting Jake on the porch. She abandoned her pursuit of Sam and began the determined climb up the porch steps, her chubby hands gripping the railings. Jake swooped her up into his arms, marveling, as he always did, at how completely these children had captured his heart. Anna had Elena's dark eyes, but Jake's stubborn chin, and her personality was a delightful mix of both parents' strongest traits. "Where's Mama?" Anna asked, settling comfortably against Jake's chest. "She's inside talking to Grandpa Tom about important grown-up things," Jake explained, smoothing Anna's dark hair. Those important grown-up things were the final details of the ranch ownership transfer that had been in negotiation for months. Tom Brennan, now approaching 80, had finally decided to officially retire and pass Whispering Pines Ranch to Jake and Eleanor. The paperwork was complex, involving not just the land transfer, but also the incorporation of the ranch as a family business that would provide security for future generations. Elena emerged from the house, her face glowing with excitement. At 38, she'd grown even more beautiful, with the confidence that came from building a successful life on her own terms. Her business degree had been completed 3 years earlier, and she now managed all the ranch's financial operations with the same quiet competence she brought to everything else. "It's official," she announced, waving a thick folder of documents. "As of today, we are the proud owners of Whispering Pines Ranch." Jake felt a surge of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. After decades of working other people's land, of never having a permanent place to call home, he now owned 1,500 acres of some of the most beautiful country in Montana. "Tom wants to make the announcement at the community barbecue next week," Eleanor continued. "He's insisting on throwing us a proper celebration." The annual community barbecue had become one of Jake's favorite traditions since settling in the valley. Local ranchers, business owners, and families would gather at the fairgrounds for an evening of food, music, and the kind of socializing that knit rural communities together. Jake had initially felt like an outsider at these events, but over the years he'd earned his place among the established families through hard work and genuine friendship. "Daddy Jake," Sam called from the yard. "Come see what I found." Jake handed Anna to Elena and jogged down to where Sam was crouched beside the fence post, examining something in the dirt. The boy had started calling him Daddy Jake to distinguish him from the Daddy Michael he'd learned about through family stories and photographs. And Jake treasured the title more than any formal recognition he'd ever received. "It's a arrowhead," Sam announced proudly, holding up a perfectly preserved piece of flint that had been shaped by human hands centuries earlier. Jake examined the artifact with appropriate seriousness. The ranch was rich with evidence of the Native Americans who had lived and hunted in the valley for thousands of years. And Elena had taught all the children to treat such discoveries with respect. "That's a beautiful find," Jake said. "We should show it to Mama and ask her what tribe might have made it." As they walked back toward the house, Jake reflected on how natural it felt to be the father these children turned to with their discoveries and questions. The role had evolved gradually, without drama or fanfare, built on countless small moments of trust and affection. The transition hadn't been without challenges. There had been difficult conversations about discipline, about family rules, about how to honor Michael's memory while building new traditions. Jake had made mistakes, moments when his bachelor habits clashed with family needs. But Elena's patience and the children's resilience had helped them navigate every obstacle. "I have news, too," Elena said, as they gathered on the porch for the evening ritual of watching the sunset paint the mountains in brilliant colors. "Dr. Patterson called this afternoon with the results of my appointment last week." Jake's attention sharpened. Elena had been to see her doctor for what she described as a routine checkup, but something in her tone suggested more significant news. Elena's smile was radiant as she placed a hand on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have another baby." Due in the spring, the announcement was met with squeals of excitement from Anna, thoughtful questions from Sam about whether it would be a boy or girl, and more subdued but equally pleased reactions from Lily and Rose. Jake found himself speechless, overwhelmed by the magnitude of Elena's gift. 6 children, a ranch of their own, a wife who was his partner in every sense of the word. Sometimes Jake had to pinch himself to make sure he wasn't dreaming. "Are you happy?" Elena asked quietly during a moment when the children were distracted by something in the yard. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Jake replied, pulling her close. "Elena, when I think about that scared, lonely man who rode into this valley 7 years ago, I can barely believe this is the same life." Elena leaned into his embrace, her hands still resting protectively over their unborn child. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't come looking for us that day? If you'd stayed in the upper pastures and never heard the bear? Jake considered the question seriously. I think we would have found each other eventually. Maybe not that day, maybe not in such dramatic circumstances, but somehow. What we have, it feels inevitable now, like it was always meant to happen. As darkness settled over the valley, the Morrison family moved inside for their evening routine. Homework was supervised, baths were given, and bedtime stories were read with the comfortable chaos that marked a household full of children. Jake tucked Sam and Anna into their beds, while Elena helped the older girls with their nighttime preparations. Later, as Jake and Elena sat together in their bedroom, reviewing the ranch ownership documents, Elena brought up a subject they'd been discussing for months. "I've been thinking about the foundation," she said, referring to their plans to establish a charitable organization focused on helping rural families in crisis. With the ranch ownership settled, we're in a position to really make it happen. The Morrison Family Foundation had been Elena's idea, inspired by their own experience of finding support and stability through Tom's generosity. They wanted to create a safety net for other families facing the kinds of challenges that could destroy rural livelihoods. Medical emergencies, natural disasters, economic downturns. "I think it's time," Jake agreed. "We've been blessed beyond anything we deserved. It's right that we find ways to pass those blessings along." As they prepared for bed, Jake found himself thinking about the long journey that had brought them to this moment. The bear attack that had nearly cost them everything had instead become the catalyst for a transformation. That seemed almost miraculous in retrospect. He thought about the scars on his ribs that reminded him daily of how close he'd come to losing everything that mattered. He thought about Elena's courage in choosing to love again after loss. He thought about Lily and Rose's resilience in accepting him as their father. He thought about Sam and Anna, who would grow up knowing only stability and love. Most of all, he thought about the ranch hand who had ridden into this valley with nothing but a horse, a few belongings, and a willingness to work hard. That man could never have imagined the life that awaited him, the family that would claim his heart, the legacy he would help build in the shadow of the Montana mountains. "Jake," Elena said softly as they settled into bed, "do you know what I'm most grateful for?" "What's that?" "That you were brave enough to charge into those woods that day. But more than that, I'm grateful that you were brave enough to stay afterward, to let us become your family, to build something permanent instead of just moving on to the next ranch." Jake pulled Elena close, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing and the miracle of new life growing within her. Outside their bedroom windows, the wilderness of Montana stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars, beautiful and dangerous and eternal, but inside the walls of the home they'd built together, there was only warmth and safety and the kind of love that could withstand any storm. The ranch hand's reward had indeed been beyond his wildest dreams, not just a wife, but a complete transformation of everything he'd thought possible for his life. As sleep claimed him, Jake Morrison understood that some stories don't really end. They just evolve into new chapters, new generations, new possibilities for love and courage, and the endless human capacity to find meaning in the wilderness of existence. The bear attack had been the beginning, not the end, and the best parts of their story were still being written in the laughter of children and the quiet moments of partnership between two people who had found their way home to each other. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.